Okay. So tonight's little talk is called Waking Up to a Wise Earth. So my starting point is this, that the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st have been marked by quite dramatic and seemingly unpredictable events. So we can think of the collapse of the Soviet Union and of communism in Eastern Europe, the destruction of the Twin Towers, the Arab Spring uprisings, and of course the financial and economic collapse of 2008. These are some of the remarkable changes and events that have shaken our world at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. Now, Buddhism emphasizes change. Buddhism teaches that everything in our experience is impermanent, and things are not fixed and separate objects, but are processes that come into being, alter, and cease in dependence on conditions. Each thing or process conditions and is conditioned by other processes. And if we cling to things as if they were permanent, then because they inevitably change, we experience suffering. This is one of the basic teachings of the Buddha. And I think, as I've mentioned before this week, intellectually this may be relatively straightforward to understand and seemingly accept. But emotionally, deep in our being, it's much harder to accept, especially when the change is unexpected. So I remember the emotional reactions of disbelief, of despair and pain to some of the events of last year of 2016. And these are emotional reactions of disbelief, despair and pain, even among many of my Buddhist friends. And these reactions of disbelief, despair and pain confirm just how hard it is sometimes to maintain equanimity and a clear mind in the face of sudden and unexpected changes. So we had Brexit, the British vote to leave the European Union. And we had the election of President Donald Trump in the United States, both events last year in 2016. And I can remember the emotional reactions of disbelief, despair and pain among many people prompted by these events, even, as I said, amongst many Buddhists. And when you examine this underlying sense of pain and despair, what you find is a kind of bewilderment, a feeling that things are spinning out of control. There appears to be no narrative or story that explains what's been happening. I think that's quite important. It doesn't appear to be a narrative or story that explains what has been happening. So there's this bewilderment. Actually, there's one book recently, I think, which does give a lively and informative attempt at a narrative explanation of our situation. It's a book called Thank You for Being Late by a man called Thomas Friedman. And he argues that the world we live in is experiencing a supernova of accelerating change that threatens to outpace humanity's capacity to adapt. And he locates the causes of this supernova of change in three interlinked accelerations: an accelerated rate of change in technology, in globalization and the economic market, and in climate change. So he calls this the age of accelerations, and he writes that this age of accelerations is surely one of the great transformative moments in history. Now, he personally is optimistic that humanity can adapt and cope with this supernova of accelerating change. And there's a lot to reflect on in his analysis and his suggestions for how we might respond to this rate of change in his book. Thank you for being late, and I recommend his book. I'm not going to spend any more time talking about that book because there's a question in my mind. What if this age of accelerations is a symptom of an even more serious problem that requires something more than adaptation to change, and instead requires a fundamental shift or step up in what it means to be human? What if the change that's going on is much more fundamental and requires a shift or step up in what it means to be human? And what if the problem requires a dramatic shift in perspective from recent human history to that of what geologists call deep time? A period of not just millions but billions of years, a vista that looks at the complete history of the evolution of our planet and of life. So if what Friedman calls the age of accelerations is one of the great transformative moments in human history, then from the perspective of deep time, we might be entering one of the most critical periods in the evolution of our planet and of life itself. And this is the crux of the argument put forward in another book called Earth in Human Hands, Shaping Our Planet's Future, by a man named David Grinspoon. And David Grinspoon is a planetary astrobiologist. So he studies major transitions in planetary evolution and the relationship between planets and life. And he reminds us that the idea is gaining ground, at least in the scientific community and maybe beyond, that we have entered a new epoch in Earth history, the so-called Anthropocene, the age of humanity, where the activity of humans has become an agent of global change as important and as powerful as the natural forces of nature that shape continents and push forward the evolution of species. So he reminds us of this idea of the Anthropocene. What he argues, though, is this. He says the recent discussion over the Anthropocene misses its central importance. So he asks the question, a rhetorical question: when did our world gain a quality that is uniquely human? And in answer to that question, he points out, we are not the first species with the capacity to make changes in landscape. Now, albeit on a much smaller scale than humans, he says, for example, beavers build dams that change the flow of streams, that cut down forests and create new meadows. Where I live in Estonia, especially in the southern part of the country, many of the streams and the small lakes are full of beavers, and they create total havoc, cutting down trees, building dams and so on, right next to where I have a a log cabin in the countryside, there's a situation like that. So he's saying we're not the first species to be able to make changes in landscapes. Nor, he says, are we the first life form with the capacity to change global climate and initiate mass extinctions. So 2.5 billion years ago, we had the emergence of photosynthetic bacteria, which started creating oxygen in the atmosphere. One of the impacts of this was it all but wiped out anaerobic bacteria, because for them oxygen is toxic. So there was a mass extinction of anaerobic bacteria when photosynthetic bacteria emerged 2.5 billion years ago. So he argues what makes the Anthropocene unprecedented is that we are becoming aware of what we are doing to this world. As he puts it, quote, "We are the species that can change the world and come to see what we are doing." So instead of unconsciously remaking the earth, we are now aware and conscious of what we are doing. With our awareness, we have lost our innocence. And while some scientists view the concept of the Anthropocene epoch as overblown when seen against the vast background of Earth history, David Grinspoon disagrees. On the contrary, he believes we are thinking too small. So he focuses on the scale of eons, which represent the major biological events of our planet. And he describes how the Earth has so far experienced only 4 major eons, each representing a completely different time of planetary history. The first eon, he says, can be called the Hadean eon, after Hades, lasting roughly the first 500 million years of Earth's history, so named because it was pure hell, with violent volcanoes, bombarding meteors, incredible heat, a veritable world of fire and brimstone, as he says. Then around 3.8 billion years ago, there's the Arch Eon beginning, with the first appearance of life. And then about 2.5 billion years ago, the Proterozoic Eon begins, when oxygen from photosynthesis begins to build up in the atmosphere, generating what they call the Great Oxygenation Event. As we noted earlier, this caused catastrophic consequences for the anaerobic bacteria that had previously dominated the planet, because for them, oxygen is toxic. And then finally, beginning about 540 million years ago, we have what's called the Phanerozoic Eon. And that started with what's called the Cambrian explosion, when life, which had previously existed as almost entirely as single-celled organisms, gave birth to a world crawling with multicellular animals and plants. So this knowledge of the eons that dominate Earth's history informs the astrobiologist's search for evidence of life on other planetary systems circulating distant stars. Can we discover evidence for a great oxygenation event or its equivalent on a different planet? Might such planets have had the equivalent of a Cambrian explosion? So this is what planetary astrobiologists are doing. They are beginning to gather evidence and information on the planets circulating distant stars to see if they can get any evidence that might hint at the emergence of life. And beyond this search, as Grinspoon puts it, the biggest question of all is whether we can find intelligent technological aliens. Just as humanity is now remaking our planet, might something similar occur elsewhere in the universe? And then he reflects that we are very unlikely to find intelligent life elsewhere, if intelligent life is only a brief phase before alien civilizations destroy themselves or otherwise lose their technological capabilities. For civilizations to find each other across the vast expanses of time and space requires that technologically advanced civilizations have great longevity. And so he argues, if we find other civilizations, it will be the ones who have made it through what he calls the bottleneck of technological adolescence. And he says there is no guarantee that emerging civilizations survive technological breakthroughs. As we know, new technology has given us for the first time the power to destroy ourselves and maybe much of the planet as well. From the perspective of deep time and astrobiology, Grinspoon believes that the beginning of a time when cognitive processes become a key part of the way a planet functions is just as significant as the dramatic planetary changes that mark the shift from one eon to another in Earth's history. And he writes, this is a quote, "The moment when cognitive processes become a dominant mechanism of change is easily as significant as the oxygenation of the atmosphere or the advent of multicellular animal life. If global intelligence becomes a lasting planetary force, then I believe it is appropriate to regard this as the beginning of Earth's fifth eon." And he goes on, what should we call this fifth eon? I propose the Sapiezoic eon. And he invents this adjective, Sapiezoic. And he's following Carl Linnaeus, the 18th century Swedish botanist. Linnaeus chose the name Homo sapiens for human beings to distinguish us from other animals within the genus Homo. And sapiens was taken from the Latin sapienta, meaning wisdom. So how does he define wisdom? He points out that wisdom differs from intelligence because it is not just a cognitive skill, but includes the ability to act with judgment born of experience. So we know someone may have a very high IQ, but that doesn't mean they have wisdom at all. They can have very high IQ. It doesn't mean they have wisdom. And he goes on to argue, whilst individual human beings and teams of human beings may have developed wisdom, he questions whether humanity can collectively gain wisdom, such that its actions arise out of full awareness of the interconnectedness of humanity and our planet. And he speculates that if we fail to make the leap to collective wisdom, other species could develop that ability in the future. And he cautions us, Earth might have a Sapiezoic eon that does not begin with us. It's quite a sobering thought, that, isn't it? Earth might have a Sapiezoic eon that does not begin with us. And to live up fully to the label sapiens that Carl Linnaeus gave us, Grinspoon argues, then we need to wake up to our full potential if we are to create a terra sapiens, a wise Earth. The question is, can humanity wake up and create a wise Earth? Now, a Buddha means one who has woken up. A Buddha literally means one who has woken up. And it's very interesting when you contemplate the Buddha and what the Buddha achieved and reflect upon that, the connection to the questions that David Grinspoon is raising. There's a Buddhist scholar called Andrew Olendzki, an American, one of my favourite Buddhist writers. And he is very much aware of the need for humanity to wake up and follow the Buddha. He says the choice is stark. Either we evolve or we die. He points out that our most basic evolutionary instincts are for individual survival at any cost. And he writes, greed ensures I will take what I need at the expense of all others, while hatred provides the impetus to destroy anyone who threatens me or stands in my way. Both forms create and support a sense of self, the one who must survive and reproduce no matter at what cost. And he argues that the problem we now face is that greed and hatred, which served us well in earlier primitive competitive environments, are now counterproductive in the interdependent world that we inhabit. The greed and hatred that in evolutionary terms kept us alive are now killing us. The adaptation required for human survival is thus an inner one. We can view the Buddha as the next step in human evolution. The Buddha demonstrated that greed, hatred, and delusion can be removed from the human psyche. He showed that these instincts, though deep, are not essential. From evolution, we have also inherited a set of cooperative impulses that encourage moving from simple concern for the self to selfless concern for the group or the community. So generosity, kindness, and wisdom can save us from ourselves. And for the Buddha, wisdom requires us to fully see with all of our being the impermanent, interdependent nature of all things. To understand that nothing exists in its own right, including ourselves. And failing to understand this causes suffering for us, for ourselves, for others and the world around us, and ultimately could result in our self-destruction. So gaining wisdom means that we have to see beyond our selfish concerns and instead act with kindness and generosity. Reflecting on humanity's place in evolution, Charles Darwin wrote, "Of all the differences between man and the lower animals, the moral sense or conscience is by far the most important. It is the most noble of all attributes of man." So if we are to evolve and become like the Buddha, then we must, as a species, find a way to combine morality and wisdom. This means we've got to aim high. And I want to finish by paraphrasing the Buddha. He said, "Just as one hand washes the other, wisdom is purified by morality, and morality is purified by wisdom. The moral one has wisdom, and the wise one has morality. And the combination of morality and wisdom is called the highest thing in the world." It's a really lovely metaphor, that this idea, just as one hand washes the other, so wisdom is purified by morality, and morality is purified by wisdom. And you can think of the equivalent of the water when we wash our hands is mindfulness. So mindfulness is what allows us to wash our hands, for morality to be purified by wisdom and wisdom to be purified by morality. So that the moral one has wisdom and the wise one has morality, and the combination of morality and wisdom is called the highest thing in the world. And I'll finish there.